Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining. I'm Christy Schmidt, Director of Marketing Communications for Farm Credit. Before we get started, just a few technology tips to keep in mind. All attendees will be muted throughout the presentation. Every once in a while, you might just want to make sure to tap your mouse so that your screen doesn't go to sleep. There will be time for questions and answers at the end of the presentation, but they can be text chatted in at any point during the presentation today, and then they'll be asked of our presenter, Mark Stephenson, at the completion of his presentation. So to send in your questions, just click on the red arrow to expand the GoToWebinar control panel in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. You'll then see a text box where you can type in your question, and then it'll come into us here. Finally, a recording of today's presentation will be available on farmcredit.com/webinars for playback at a later time. If you're having trouble accessing this recording, you can contact me, Christy Schmidt, at 1-800-562-2235. And now I'll pass it over to Tom Cosgrove to get started.
Thanks, Christy. Good morning. I'm Tom Cosgrove, Vice President of Public Affairs and Knowledge Exchange here at Farm Credit East. And welcome to today's webinar on the Dairy Margin Protection Program. So in today's webinar, we're going to get an update on the current dairy and feed markets, as well as a look forward to next year, which is certainly important as producers consider their options in terms of enrolling in the 2016 Dairy Margin Protection Program, and discuss some of the tools that are available to help producers make that decision. To do that, we're pleased to be joined today by Dr. Mark Stephenson, Director of Dairy Policy Analysis at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Of course, Mark is well known to those of us here in the Northeast. Originally from Michigan, Mark earned his PhD at Cornell and spent many years as part of the Cornell program on dairy markets and policy. I would say that before we begin, the Dairy Markets and Policy Group in Mark and his team, they and their website, dairymarkets.org, a great resource with market information, economics and policy, as well as some of the tools that are available to producers as they weigh their options in advance of the sign-up for 2016. So we feel fortunate to have Mark join us today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to him for his presentation.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. Let me get started here. I will show my screen. And I'll bring up the first slide. Just to double check, can you see that and hear me all right?
Everything looks good.
Okay. I want to cover just a few things today relative to the Margin Protection Program decision that we are coming up against the deadline for sign-up and enrollment this year. I want to give you a little bit of an overview of the margin forecast for the year ahead. I want to talk about some updates to that Margin Protection Program Dairy Decision Tool that we have. We'll speak just a little bit about understanding some financial risk that farmers face and demonstrate a couple of the new advanced features that we're calling them of this decision tool. So without further ado, let's get started on this. It hasn't really been too long since we used to think about a $16 or $17 milk price as being a pretty low milk price. We've seen those in the last few years, certainly in 2010 and 2012. But we also, at that time, were considering our highs for all U.S. all milk prices being around $22. But this last year, we had a much higher high than that. In fact, the entire year averaged about $25 a hundredweight for all milk price, and we've since plunged to that area that we would call lows, around that $17 range or down into the $16 range. So I think that a lot of people have questions about whether this is the bottom of that time period, and if not, how low might it possibly go, and how would that really impact my business? This is a very different environment for making decisions about sign-up for the Margin Protection Program than it was last year when we were looking at the $25 milk prices. So it's a different year. The other thing that's been true, of course, is that our feed values have been declining. Corn has not been facing quite as much of purchase and balance, and we've had some very strong growing years and not as much use in ethanol, so there's been more available for feed, and the prices of corn and other feed ingredients has declined. So the Margin Protection Program ration value has also declined with that. But you can put those two things together, that high feed price that we had last year and the declining, or the high milk price that we had last year and the declining feed prices, and you can also see that we had the highest margin year ever that we would have had the program been in place. We went back and calculated this over a good many years, and last year was just a stunning year. You'll also notice that I'm projecting here in that red bar clear on the right what we think the average is going to be for this year by the time we finish 2015, which is just a little above $8. That's a very ordinary kind of margin for U.S. milk prices from historic values. $8.50 is actually about an average, so we're just a little below what would be the average values, but certainly nothing like a 2009 or a 2012 year actually was in the way of this as a calibration for how well farms are doing. But last year that big margin was really a marketplace that was also telling dairy producers that the market wanted more of your product. They wanted more milk. That's why we get big milk prices, and it's a signal to say let's make some more milk. The thing that has surprised me is that U.S. dairy producers were cautious in their increases. We didn't see a whole lot of expansion going on, but depending on where you were, we've had a fair amount of milk. Maybe a little bit hard to see when you look at this chart. This is showing you the average daily U.S. milk production. You can see the ups and downs. Those are the seasonal swings that we still see in milk production every year, and there is a general trend that would show you that we've been increasing in milk production, but it's a little hard to tell from this whether this pace has been above ordinary levels of increase or if it's just kind of ordinary. So we can look at the data in a little bit different way, and that is to take a look at it as a % change in milk production from the same month or year earlier. That's what this chart's doing. Ordinarily, we're increasing somewhere between 1 and 2%. Occasionally, we get to those highs that might touch 4%, and occasionally, we actually have a decrease in milk production that you can see most prominently there in that 2009 time period. But right now, our milk production increases have been in that 1 to 2% range that we would call ordinary for us. The thing that we ought to realize is that this has been very much, however, a tale of two different regions in the country. The white states are states that don't report monthly milk production, but the green and or red states are states that do. And this is looking at the first half of the year, the change in milk production relative to those same months in 2014. And you'll notice that the traditional dairy states, the Northeast and the upper Midwest, have all been states that have increased milk production really quite substantially. And my goodness, we can look at a couple of states like South Dakota and Michigan where those increases have been about 8%. And even Pennsylvania, in there it's more than 3% during this time period. So there's been quite a lot of milk production, and of course we've all read the stories about milk chasing capacity in these parts of the country where we've been looking for a home for that milk, and some milk actually being dumped. That was more sensational headlines than it was any real volume, but nevertheless it's indicative of the fact that there's been plenty of milk in some regions. The other thing that I think is quite telling are those western states, the states that we've come to think of as being the big growth states, particularly California. California in the first half of the year has been down just about 3% in milk production. So this is a substantial decline from the largest milk producing state in the country. The curious thing to me is that this big decline in milk production in California is almost exactly offset by the even larger increase in milk production in Wisconsin. So there have been some real trade-offs here as to where milk is being produced and where it isn't, and that's actually important when we think about this MPP decision this year. I'll come back to that a little bit later. California, as part of the reason that we've seen this decline, has been the drought. This drought has been severe for the western states. And in fact, it's worse than our recorded history of weather data, which goes back a couple of hundred years at least. they have to look at the rings, the growth rings in the blue oak trees, I guess, of the western states to determine that it's been 1,200 years since we've seen a drought as severe as what we've been experiencing currently. And that drought has been ongoing now for about 4 years. It really hasn't impacted dairy very much until this last year. The water allocation and water rights issues in the West have meant that irrigating crops such as alfalfa and corn has not always been possible. And in fact, there have been crops that have been planted and maybe up. For example, corn that was 3 or 4 feet high, and the water ration simply cut off at that point. So they didn't even have a chance to see that crop to maturity and then stop the water. And that's certainly hitting western states. Just to give you a comparison of what that has meant, I pulled together a couple of prices from Wisconsin and from California. The price of hay in Wisconsin has been about $150 a ton for prime alfalfa, and in California about $260 a ton. Corn has been about $3.50 a bushel in Wisconsin and about $5 in California. Soybean meal about $3.70 in Wisconsin and $4.20 in California. So a considerable price difference for feeding dairy cows in California, and they've been much more creative with the rations in California, trying to find alternative sources of feed. One of the unusual metrics that you can look at, and I'm not trying to make this all about California and Wisconsin, but California has been a very progressive dairy state, and they've had milk production per cow that has exceeded Wisconsin all the way back into the 1950s. And you can look at a graph like this and see some of this up and down trend that's a seasonal issue with heat and feeds. But as far as California goes, there's been no discernible trend in milk production. It's been pretty flat all the way through this time period going back through 2010. Whereas with Wisconsin, there's been kind of a trend of increasing milk production, and at the end of this last couple of months, we've actually seen Wisconsin's production per cow being higher than California's. That is a long-term difference that's been demonstrating, I think, the impact of feed costs. There's also been a difference in milk prices. The all milk price that we use in the margin calculation is a U.S. all milk price, but we do have all milk prices for each of the states too. And when you look at Wisconsin's all milk price versus California's, Wisconsin's has been higher forever, but also focus just a little bit on 2015, which is all the way out on the right-hand side of that graph, and that difference has been quite a bit higher too. California has been producing a fair amount of what we would call Class 4 dairy products, which are butters and powders. And the powders in particular have been of very low prices, and the milk price as such in California has been lower than ordinary. So if you put those two things together, the margins have been very different in those, and I think explain why the West has been declining in milk production. The opinions about prices change over time. This is just showing you the futures market contract for November milk production, and it's showing you in the red Class 3 milk prices and in the green Class 4 milk prices. Those just a few months ago, back into April, had been about $1 apart at about $16.25 for Class 4 and $17.25 for Class 3. They stayed $1 apart until we got into June, and that gap began to widen, with Class 4 falling much more rapidly. And in the last month or month and a half, we've seen that gap has been closing. Class 3 prices falling a bit, and Class 4 recovering quite substantially as well. So the futures market is trying to incorporate all of the information we have about milk production, demand for dairy products, stocks, competitors, etc., and broil that into the futures values for milk. And the futures opinions have been changing quite a bit. Same thing's been true for feed prices. You'll notice that we had low and declining futures opinions for December delivery of corn. contract going right up until mid-June, and then we had a big spike as we began to get weather reports that were indicating a cold, wet, especially eastern part of the Corn Belt. Those prices increased nearly $1 a bushel, and then from that USDA report said, well, maybe it's not as bad as we thought, and we got a pretty big decline again. So opinions change on feed prices as well. Now we can put those feed prices and futures milk prices together and estimate what we think this margin is going to be. And we do that in this Dairy Decision Tool that we have online. And I want to go back in time to last year at what should have been the end of the sign-up period, which was the end of September 2014. That's that top graph up there. And you can see that the forecasts by the futures markets for this margin would have been in the $10.50 range for all of 2015. Now you'll know that we haven't had that kind of margin. It's been worse than what futures markets were forecasting at that point in time for the entirety of 2015. In fact, I showed you the column chart that indicated that our margin will average just barely above $8 for the year. And if you look down below at the bottom graph, you can see the futures opinions as of yesterday. And those opinions included that our August price is probably going to be just barely below $8 and then climbing a little bit, and that we would be, just hovering above that 8 and on into the $9 range for much of 2016. So futures markets would say it's going to be a pretty average year next year, not a lot of movement in those prices. Now, I want to talk just a little bit also about why we've been having milk prices that have been maybe as low as they've been, or in fact I want to try to show you that they've been as good as they have been, which may sound counterintuitive to you. But we have to look at our domestic economy. Our sales of dairy products domestically have actually been very, very good. There's a survey that's done every month, and it's called the Consumer Confidence Survey. And there are two sets of questions that they ask of consumers when they do the polling. One of them is about, how do you feel about the economy today? And that's what's called the present situation. That's the blue line. The other set of questions is about, what do you expect the economy to do in the not too distant future, but it is the future that they're asking about. Go back to 2006, 7, 8. You'll see there that the blue line, the present situation, consumers were saying, oh, this is great. I mean, today is good. My 401k is big. You know, we've been in great shape. Couldn't feel any better about it. But that other set of questions was about the future, and you can see the green line at that time was well below what the present situation was. So they were saying, it's good today, but I'm actually concerned about tomorrow. Consumers distill a lot of news. They hear rumblings about their jobs, a number of other things, and you know, it almost gets to be self-fulfilling prophecy when that happens, because consumers start to tighten up their spending patterns. They don't go out to eat as much. Maybe they don't put that new flat screen TV in the man cave like we might as well have done in really good times. And so when their expenditures tighten, we also find the growth in our economy falling off. And you'll see what happened there with consumer confidence right into our recession of 2009. Now, during that time period and afterward for the next several years, you'll notice that the questions were just reversed. The blue line was saying the economy isn't very good today. In fact, it's terrible. You know, the banks have been failing. We've got foreclosures on mortgages. It's just not a good situation. But I'm optimistic about the future, green line. And that starts to pull us back up again. We begin to feel better about the economy and start spending. The whole reason I'm talking about this particular graph is to focus on 2015. 2015 has shown us that, in general, this consumer confidence has been increasing. But we've spent almost a year now with consumers saying, it's pretty good today, actually. It's much better than it has been, but I'm concerned about the future. So I'm a little concerned about the future when I see that. Are consumers trying to tell us that they're worried about the economy, and will they retreat from their spending? This impacts dairy product sales domestically. So this could presage a little bit of problems for us. We need exports. We've had a great economy for selling our dairy products domestically, but we frankly can't live without dairy exports. This graph is showing you the rolling average percent of milk supply that's been sold as exports. Used to be pre-2000, 2002, about 3 to 4% of our milk supply, and about the same amount was imported. And you know, about 2005, that really began to take off, and we were starting to sell much more as exports until 2009. And you'll see the trough there of 2009 going into 2010. The recession that we had was not just a recession in the U.S., but it was a global recession. And some of our buyers of dairy products overseas just simply said, we don't want as much dairy product. And that stayed at home, and that's what pushed our milk prices way down into 2009 levels. That was a loss of about 2% of our milk production in sales that stayed home. We've recovered, and we've had good sales right on through 2014, but look at 2015 now, and look at the decline there. It's not quite 2%, but it's getting very close to it. It's getting to almost the same level that gave us the big decline in milk prices in 2009. So this raises some warning bells for me as well. We have not been competitive in some of the dairy products that we've been selling overseas. Admittedly, most of our sales are in milk powders, skim milk powder and whey powder and lactose, but we've also in the last few years sold quite a bit of cheese. However, when our cheese prices, shown in the red line here, get well above those of Oceania, shown in that green range, that's when we are not competitive with sales of those products, at least without some level of support. And we're in that kind of position right now. So cheese sales are hard for us to do with these kind of price differences. It's even more true for butter. You know, this is a good indication in the green and the blue bands up there showing you what was happening with European prices for butter. Europe had its high milk price year not in 2014 like we did. They had their high milk price year in 2013. And in 2014, they had a big slide in prices, and that's continued right through 2015 for them, whereas our prices had been much higher. And we are actually at the point with butter prices right now that butter can jump the tariff barriers that we have, and we've been importing butter into this country. So, you know, we aren't competitive on these two products. The Fonterra, New Zealand's large cooperative that has sole export trading rights in New Zealand, also sells dairy product through an auction. They call it the global dairy trade. And that global dairy trade has been going for several years now. And you'll notice that this had really been, generally speaking, in decline after 2014. They hit their high point, as I indicated, in 2013 and have been declining since that time period. They hit their lowest point ever, actually, in 2015, a couple of trading sessions ago. Since that time, we've had a couple of rebounded in global dairy prices, and so I'm hopeful that we may be past the worst and maybe bringing some of those world prices back up again. But the global dairy trade index has really not been indicating anything very strong for milk prices around the world. The U.S. farm milk prices have actually held up much better than most. Now, I'm showing in this slide here three of the world's large, in fact, the largest three exporting countries or groups of countries. And those are the European Union in that dashed blue line, the U.S. in the red line, and New Zealand in the green line. And for the most part, those prices since about 2007 have been moving together because we're all experiencing the same kind of market pressures. But if you notice out here in 2015, clear on the right-hand side of the graph, I've translated this back into dollars per hundredweight, and the U.S. all milk price was about $18.38 or $18.40 during that time period, compared with the European Union at $13.61 and New Zealand's milk prices at $10.61. It's a big gap, and clearly our milk prices have held up better. This is mostly a result of our domestic markets allowing us to do that. But if we can't sell dairy products overseas, that's going to stay on our shore. It's going to put severe downward pressure on prices. The exports have needed a boost, and cooperatives working together has been very active for months now. You'll notice here every single week there's an announcement of CWT assists in sales of products like cheese, whole milk powder, which is a higher fat product, and occasionally butter, and they have helped move dairy products. Some of our other big sellers like skim milk powder and whey products haven't needed any export assistance to sell. Those prices are down at world market levels. There have been some other factors that have given us some pretty stiff headwinds as far as exporting. Because we've had fears about sovereign debt crisis in other European countries, and we've heard about China's economy slowing down, the Russian economy in difficulties as they've faced sanctions. We've seen that there's been a flight of currency to invest in the U.S., and when that happens, the U.S. dollar is strengthened. Sounds like a good thing, but it actually makes our dairy products look more expensive to the rest of the world. That hasn't helped us any in those export sales, and I think that it's going to continue to give us some problems for the next several months, maybe even years, as our dollar is fairly strong. So it's just another factor. If we look at the export competitors' milk supply last year, New Zealand was in a recovery year from a drought the year before that, and their milk production was up about 12% year over year. This year, New Zealand is forecast to decline by about 2% from their last year high-level mark. And then this is mostly because of the very low milk prices that they've been receiving. It's been brutal for New Zealand dairy farmers. European Union has not had a good time with milk prices either, but they're forecast to be up about 1.2% with the quotas now coming off. And this New Zealand loss of 2% is more than offset by the European Union's increase, just because they're a much larger milk producing region than New Zealand is. So there is more milk and forecast to be more milk on the market in this year ahead. There's one thing that might help us a little bit, and that is actually weather patterns. The climatologists say that we are experiencing the strongest El Nino, or the buildup of warm water in the Pacific is the strongest El Nino that we've seen in 50 years. And as that rolls into the winter months, we could start seeing more stormy weather on the west coast. That's a good thing, or could be a good thing for California, although those don't usually come as gentle rains, but rather torrential ones. But I think California would take water in any form it could get it now. It would give milder weather in this upper Midwest region. But what's interesting about the El Nino is not so much what happens here at home, but what happens on the other side of the Pacific. It's typical for strong El Ninos to provide hot, dry, drought seasons to Oceania. And Australia and New Zealand might be expected to have real difficulties producing even that 2% decline in milk that they're forecasting now. So El Nino could be a big impact. We'll have to watch and see how that continues to form this winter. You know, if milk does not look like a good opportunity for us or a good option, we have the opportunity to cull some of our more marginal animals. And in fact, we've done quite a bit of that. In 2014, the margins were so good that people kept some of those three-titted cows or animals that you might have otherwise culled in the herd to produce a little bit more milk. But the cull cow price, the beef price, is fantastic now. It is double what it was just a few years ago. And if we need to move a few animals into that slaughter area, it's probably a pretty good option to actually producing lower priced milk. So my forecast is that our relatively strong U.S. economy is helping consume dairy products here at home, and it should continue to do that, but there are a couple of little warning signs out there. The dairy exports will become even more of an issue in the next few months. I think we need to watch inventory levels. So watch particularly cheese inventories and butter inventories. If those start to build, then we're going to see much more downward pressure on our domestic milk prices. My deduction is that the MPP margin is going to be worse than futures market forecasts now suggest through 2016. And, you know, frankly, we know the futures markets are going to be wrong. The real question is, are they going to be wrong in the pessimistic or the optimistic direction, and by how much? And I think that my forecast, for me at least, is pointing to the likelihood that they could be worse than what we're suggesting now with that decision tool. So let's just give a real quick review of MPP for those producers who may be actually considering signing up this year. Pennsylvania and New York had lower than average sign-ups last year, so there's some room certainly for sign-ups. It's an insurance-like product. You pay a premium and you'll receive an indemnity if one's due to you. You've already got a production history in most likelihood, unless you just started producing milk recently. And it will be the highest annual production in 2011, 12, or 13. Each year, you're going to get a choice of coverage, both percentage of how much of your historic production you want to cover, and in the level that you want to cover, between $4, which is considered to be a catastrophic margin, and $8 in 50-cent increments. And the sign-up goes every year from July 1st through September 30th. We are hearing some rumblings. FSA has been petitioned to request an extension of that sign-up period. I don't know if it'll be granted or not, but September 30th is still in our sights for the end of this sign-up period. This protection is based on this difference between the U.S. all milk cost of a ration. It's not your farm's value. It's a national value out here. And those margin values are calculated every month, but they'll be averaged in 2-month pairs. And that margin level for those 2-month pairs would determine if you have an indemnity payment coming. So again, it's a national measure and not your farm measure. The premium rates are in 2 different tiers. The first tier of premiums is at a real discount, and that's for the first 4 million pounds that you would cover. So if you are a 6 million pound historic production average, your first 4 million pounds that you choose to cover would be at this lower tier rate. And you can see that this increases from a 0 cost at the $4 level on up through $8, which would be 47.5 cents a hundredweight for that first 4 million pounds of milk. Any milk covered above that is at the higher tier levels, and it's quite a bit more expensive. There's also a $100 annual fee that is due for any level of coverage, including that catastrophic level at $4. The premium rates rise rather steeply after you get above $6 or $6.50, especially true for the above 4 million pounds, the tier 2 rates, but also true for even the first tier rates. We know that these are reasonably subsidized premiums, but we just don't know by how much, because we have a hard time calculating what's actuarially fair in this kind of environment. Just a real quick look back at 2 years time period. 2009 we know is a devastating year. That graphic on the left there in the blue bars is showing you what the actual margin calculations were in those months. And the green bars on top of that are showing you what the payments would have been for MPP indemnities if this farm had invested at the $8 level. You can see on that right-hand graph that it was a positive net benefit to dairy farms at every level of coverage, but the biggest net benefit was at the highest level of coverage. Just for a point of reference, MILC in that year would have paid this farm that I'm showing you as an example here, which was 175 cows producing 23,000 pounds per cow. That's about 4 million pound production history. Would have paid that farm about $45,000 in MILC which is somewhere between the $5 and $5.50 level of coverage. 2014 was, in my opinion, every bit as unusual a year as 2009 was, but it was unusual in the opposite direction, a great year. You can see that there were no months in which the margin got down to or below $8, so there were no payments that would have been possible. And in a year like that, you probably would have said, I would choose to be down at that $4 level of coverage if you could have been. So what does the decision look like today? This is the forecast of those futures markets values, and we showed this graph before, but it is demonstrating that the black line there is above that $8 level of coverage in all the months of 2016. It's close to, but it's not above it, or not below it. However, we've also recognized that there's some chance, some probability that the futures market forecasts are going to be wrong, and that's what we try to show with those red and green lines in there. The options prices on futures contracts give us some idea about the confidence that traders have in those settlement values when the trading closes each day, and we use those to calculate a confidence interval. The bands are showing you in the red the 25% confidence interval. The green is also 25% confidence. So somewhere in that band from a high of the green to the low of the red is 50% confidence that the actual value will be in there. There's still a chance that it could be above that or below it, but nevertheless, it shows you the likelihoods. You can also see in that decision tool not just a forecast graph, but a probability table which averages the forecast by the 2-month pairs. And the expected value there is the value that those futures markets would be suggesting each time period. And again, there's no time period in 2016 in which those expected values would fall below the $8, but there's a probability it could happen. In fact, you'll notice that the probability is something like 40% in most of those 2-month pairs that the margin could be below $8. So this chart is another way to look at that. It's not going to be unheard of that we could have payment. This year, you also need to answer 2 questions if you're going to go in and want to look at your opportunity for selecting coverage levels. The questions are going to be, did you participate last year? If so, you check the box. And did you pay that $100 administrative fee in a timely manner? And if you can say yes to both of those, then you get a bump in your production history. And this is, if you've answered yes to both of those, we'll automatically calculate that for you. If you say yes, then it will tell you that your production history is now no longer 4 million pounds, but you can actually protect up to 4,140,000 pounds of milk. So the production history does increase by the annual percentage of milk production increase in the U.S. And for this particular farm, if we would choose to cover 90% of our production history, that would be about 3,700,000 pounds of milk. You can see what the administrative fees are and what the expected payments would be at those different levels. This is actually a little bit different today than what this graph is showing you. This was generated a few days ago. It's not quite as positive in terms of net expected returns because futures market has become a little bit more optimistic than this is showing. We've had some changes in the MPP Decision Tool this year. Last year when we were talking about this, we really showed those graphs that I just showed you and the tables, and I think that it encouraged people to look at this with a profit center approach. In other words, use market level information. Is it likely that the MPP is going to pay out? What are the expected payments out here? How would it have worked in the past? This is all the concept about what can we possibly get out of MPP as opposed to thinking of it as risk management, which is what it was really set up to do. And so this year we want to offer the opportunity to look at this or view it as a stress test approach on your farm too. Given the fact that farms can have financial stress in a real down year out here, how likely is it that your farm can get through those time periods without having to have that uncomfortable conversation with the bank? So there's a personalized assessment specific to each farm with a few inputs, and I'll show you those. And the question is, does this reduce risk on my farm to tolerable levels out here? Is it sufficient risk coverage, or should I also use private risk management tools like forward contracts or futures markets hedging? When you first go into this, you'll notice up here in the left-hand, upper left-hand area, MPP is where our traditional decision tool is. MPP Advanced is where these new portions of the tool are. Every day, these values in the boxes down here are updated with what the futures market forecast for the all milk price, hay price, soybean meal, and corn prices would be. But you can change those yourself individually if you'd like to, if you think you have a better idea about what the prices may be. And it will automatically change the graphic. Right now, this was done, again, as I said, a few days ago, and it's not quite up to date. At that time, the average margin for the year was being forecast at $8.30. You can see down here in the bottom right-hand corner that the average for 2016 at that time was $8.30, and it would have forecast a very small payment of 15 cents per hundredweight on the $8 level of coverage and nothing more. You can also select any one of these lines over here and use this slider value over on the left-hand side to simply say, I want to move all of these prices down within the probability range, but nevertheless move them down just to stress test my farm. But let's take a look at this with the average values first. So you click on the stress test button in the bottom right, and it will take you, well, excuse me, my next slide here is showing you what happens when you pull this slider value down. Again, it was up here. If you pulled it down and the all milk price was chosen, it lowered those all milk prices, and now is showing you the possibility of payments at a lot of different levels. So let's go into the stress test now and show you what the inputs are. The inputs are over here on this left-hand side. Most of them very easy for individual producers to enter. You enter values like the number of cows you have in the herd, what your average milk production per cow is, and when those two things are included, it's going to calculate down here for you what your expected milk production is in this year ahead. You've entered your production history, so there's a certain amount of milk production that you wouldn't be able to cover here. You're also entering the expenses that you have on your farm other than feed costs. Feed costs are going to be taken account of in the ration value that we have. So we want you to enter all of the costs that you have, like interest costs, like utility costs, labor costs, etc. Everything but feed. There's another box right here that is an income over feed cost basis. Now the reason we have this in is that our MPP margin is this national margin, and your basis in every region, and in fact each individual farm, is going to be different than what that MPP margin is. This gives you a chance to put your actual values into context with the MPP margin. In the upper Midwest, we find a lot of farms have a positive basis of about $1. If I was looking at a California farm, they probably have a negative basis of maybe $1 to $1.50. In the Northeast, the basis value is probably even higher than the $1 that I'm showing here. Farms may also have other revenues such as cull cows or beef if you're raising them, crops that may be sold each year, and they should be put on a per hundredweight basis. Once you've entered your production history, below that in the risk management set of boxes over here, you can also change your coverage level, and you can add or include other sorts of risk managements that you might have, including how much of your milk is covered by a forward contract or by CME hedging, etc., and how much of your income over feed cost is protected that way. Then we get down to the interesting values of your own financials. There are just a few that we're going to ask for. We want to know what the working capital per cow is, and I'll explain what that is just a bit later. We want to know what the asset value is on a market level basis per cow, how much you have invested in land, buildings, etc. Not on a book value, but on a market value. We also want to know what your market value debt to asset ratio is. And then finally, we ask you to put in your own idea of how large an impact you have on your asset values if we're in a crisis situation. What do I mean by that? I'm talking about what happened in a year like 2009 when we had a tremendous decline in milk price. We also saw asset values on farms decline as well. So a good example is the value of a dairy cow dropped from maybe $2,000 a cow to about $1,100 or $1,200 a cow. Big decline in that asset value. Land values may have declined a little bit, but not too much. So you can put in your own values for how much a crisis impacts that. That doesn't come into play unless the margins you're looking at actually are in crisis. This value right here is carried over from that previous page of the graph here. You can see in this bottom area, 830 in this particular case. It gets carried over here. This is a different example slightly of $8.38. And then we get the value shown over here. So for 2016, this would be projecting positive profitability for the farm under all levels of coverage. Actually an increase in working capital per cow because the farm is profitable, and a reduction in the debt to asset ratio because again the farm is having profitable year. So you can see what the coverage levels would be and what the costs would be on a per hundredweight of all your milk, not just the milk that's covered. So key measures of financial strength. One of them is liquidity. Do you have enough cash to meet your current financial obligations as they come due? This is measured in this particular tool as working capital per cow, and that's $1 per cow value. Working capital is defined as your current assets minus your current liabilities, and current assets, of course, are things like cash, but also feed and assets that are likely to be used over the course of this year. And current liabilities, of course, include all of the costs that you're going to be facing and would have to pay on a yearly basis, including the portion of your debt loans that need to be paid. It's calculated from the balance sheet. A standard rule of thumb is that you need at least 30 days of cash flow, which is about $200 per cow. And it's more desirable, I guess, given the volatility we've had, to have maybe a third of the value of farm production, which is roughly $600 per cow. It doesn't deal with the timing of revenues and expenses, but liquidity is what helps you get through those troughs in each year. So that's why you need some liquidity. The solvency measures we have out here is our debt to asset ratio, is the way we're measuring it. And it has to do with the share of the business assets that are owed to your creditors. Assets are valued at this market rate. They're calculated from the balance sheet. And we have a lot of established dairy farms that have debt to asset ratios maybe around 30% or even less. But in a crisis year like 2009, we find that those debt to asset ratios can climb very quickly. In general, the debt to asset ratio of 60 or above is considered to be a poor ratio. You're probably being watched very closely by your creditors. If it's between 40 and 60%, it may be fair, it's okay, and anything under 40 is probably thought to be rather good. So lower is better in the case of a debt to asset ratio. How do you handle poor margins on a farm? Well, the first thing you do is use liquidity. Those cash reserves are tapped, You may sell some current assets, and that's neither one of those are particularly good for the long-term portion of the business, but it does help you get through some of those things. Short-term loans can also bridge smaller amounts of gap that we have in there, and equity is usually used to acquire those operating loans. But if it's particularly bad, you may have to restructure debt or go to longer-term loans to get you through a really bad year. So let's take a look at that same farm that we looked at before, and I'm going back in time. You'll notice that over here on the right-hand side toward the bottom, we can choose different years, and this brings in the actual values that would have been for the all milk price and the feed prices out here in the margins. You can't change these now because these are historic values, but it does show you what happened in 2009. You'll see here what the payments would have been if this program had been in place, and we can also now take these values and go back over to our stress test to see what happened to this farm. Same input values we had before, except now we're looking at the margin protection program in 2009, what actually happened here. You'll notice that we didn't have MPP for one thing, and this farm would have been unprofitable at the level of nearly $2.50 a hundredweight. So every hundredweight of milk would have lost nearly $2.50 in that year. That would have evaporated the working capital per cow to negative numbers, not sustainable at all, and the debt-to-asset ratio would have increased from 55% up to about 61%. That would have been in the uncomfortable situation. Now, if you had MPP available and had invested at some levels of protection, you'll notice that your profitability would have improved out here, even all the way up to the point at the $7.50 or $8 level, to where it would have been a break-even type of year for this farm. Liquidity would have been maintained, and your debt-to-asset ratio would have declined a little bit, but this is almost entirely because of the impact on asset values and not because you weren't profitable that year. So MPP can certainly impact a farm like this. Let's take a look at 2016. And now, instead of using the default values on here, we're going to take this all milk price and we're going to lower it over here by pulling this down a little bit to levels that we've seen before. You know, and this brings this average margin down to about a $5 level, or $5.75 level. Let's look at that on our farm. Let's stress test this operation to see if we could get through that, should this kind of number actually show up for us. Again, this farm is losing money. If we didn't do much of anything, about $1.25 a hundredweight. That can be improved to a break-even point. If the farm bought up and liquidity can be maintained on that farm at different levels and solvency not as badly impacted. So this is the way a program like this can work for an operation. You know, you might consider, how much am I willing to spend on protection? If you look over here in this cost per hundredweight of all milk, you might say, I'm willing to spend 5 cents, or I'm willing to spend 8 cents, or some particular level for protection out here. You do certainly reduce your exposure to losses if that's the case. So in conclusion out here, the market conditions this year are very different than we've seen in this sign-up period than they were last year. It's not the wrong thing to do. If a farm can afford to self-insure, then going along for the ride is not a bad approach. I'd use an example like Bill Gates. I don't know if Bill Gates has health insurance or not. He probably does. But I don't think it actually matters, because I think Bill Gates could probably afford any medical procedure known to mankind if he really needed to. He can afford to self-insure. Those MPP premiums we know are subsidized. We don't know by how much. So, you know, if you are a farm that's not terribly financially stressed, then maybe you don't have to think about doing this as a risk management or a stress test approach. You might think about this as, do I think there's a likelihood of a payoff this next year? So taking that profit center approach might be reasonable. But if you're a farm that can't afford to self-insure, you really should be considering some kind of more formal risk management approach out there. And if that's the case, then I would encourage you to look at the MPP as part of that. It may not be enough for you. And as I put down here, particularly for larger farms, MPP coverage might not be adequate because the cost of premiums get to be much higher for larger farms, and you may want to not look much above that $6, $6.50 level and think about forward contract. You might want to think about hedging, or you might want to think about swaps as another possibility. But you should have some risk management in place. With that, I would take some questions if folks have any.
Great, Mark. Thanks for the presentation. There's a few questions that are queuing up, so I will, but I think to kind of get things rolling, I want to go back to a slide that you mentioned in terms of the, on the one of the farm stress test slides.
Yes.
Get a little feedback here, maybe. You know, you talked about the basis in terms of the difference between the producer's costs for feed and the national index.
Mark, you might need to mute your computer again. We're picking up some feedback.
My apologies for that. Let me see if I can fix it.
Okay, so Mark, in terms of the,
is this better now?
Well,
I think so.
Okay, we'll see. So yeah, going back to the basis issue, as we look at the difference between producer's feed cost and the national index, you know, how can you use the tool to determine, you know, given those differences, how can a producer use the tool to determine what level of coverage might make sense?
Sure. Well, one thing, can you hear me okay now without the feedback? I'm sorry about that.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Okay. One of the things that producers can do and probably should do, if you've had some annual kind of summary that you're doing looking at the financial measurement out here on your farm, you probably have some idea about what your feed costs per hundredweight are. And those feed costs should include the cost that you're going to assign to producing crops that you're growing. So the fertilizer, the seeds, the allocation of you know, your equipment and labor that goes to the crop production side. But when you've done that, you can take a look at that level, and you can take a look at the expenses that you have other than feed on your farm. That is an input here that you are asked to enter and should be using. It also is the case that when you look at a year with those other costs out here and your feed costs, as well as your own farm's milk price, and compare that to what the MPP margin was, you'll have a very good idea about what your income over feed cost basis is. That's that dollar that's shown up right here in in this area of the stress test. Now, it takes a little bit of work. I think that one of the things that we're trying to put together now are a number of cases where we're looking at some different costs, and that's for different farm sizes and different business models in different regions of the country. That may help guide people on a few of these costs if they don't have them readily available. But the best thing to do, of course, is to have enough analysis of your own farm situation to be able to look at that and compare it to what the MPP margins had been.
Okay, great. Hey, one question came in was just about will Mark's slides be available, and the answer to that is yes. We're going to make those available when we post the recording. Another question came in, Mark, and this is maybe a little bit beyond the scope of today's presentation, but I think still relevant, about the LGM-DAIRY crop insurance product. Understanding there is that it's kind of an either-or in terms of signing up for MPP versus LGM-DAIRY. I guess I'm curious, has the Dairy Markets and Policy Group looked at any of the analysis scenarios to that, or any comment in terms of LGM dairy and how that compares to margin protection program?
We have last year. We haven't updated that this year to take a look at it, but you'll also notice on this slide up here in this upper left-hand corner that there is another button on the screen that says LGM, and if you click on that, it takes you right to the LGM analyzer. So you can look at any point in time about what the LGM opportunities might be for you if there's funding available for the program, and compare that to the MPP program. So I would encourage producers who haven't already signed up for MPP to look at both of these opportunities. A couple of just general comments. One is that if you've signed up for MPP, you're all done now because you are locked into the MPP program for the life of the Farm Bill, which goes through 2018, and LGM is excluded from something you could possibly do. If you haven't signed up for MPP yet, LGM is a possibility. Now, last year we had some very good margins for LGM dairy at the time of sign up, and I know we had several people that used LGM instead of MPP. You're not precluded from signing up for the MPP this year, but again, if you do that this year, you can't have any active LGM contracts available by the time you get to the first of the year. So your LGM contracts would have to end by December before you would be able to be eligible for the MPP program.
Okay, good. Very, very helpful. Mark, another question came in, kind of comes at a sort of a different aspect of the risk management decision or process on a farm. In terms of producers' markets for their milk, one of the things that we've seen here in the Northeast is there's some producers who actually were dropped by their handlers, particularly during the spring flush when there was so much milk, across the country, but particularly here in the region. And I guess I want to get your comment. You have a little bit more of a national perspective. Given that a lot of the co-ops that have maybe more relationships and more outlets in terms of processing their milk, I wonder what you're seeing across the country in terms of, are you seeing that in terms of producers being dropped or having issues finding markets for their milk?
There's not been very many places where producers have been dropped. In the Northeast, there was some of that happened, I know, I'm aware of. In most parts of the country, we've had the area from the East Coast all the way through the upper Midwest at any rate, we've been stressed at capacity and oftentimes milk looking for a home for processing. So cooperatives have been very active moving milk around the country. Michigan's a great example. With that 8 to 9% increase that they've had in milk production in some of these months, they've run out of processing capacity, and loads of milk have regularly been coming over to Wisconsin looking for a home. That gets to be very expensive. So the dairy producers who are in that problem of being very surplus have been bearing the cost of finding a home for that milk. A, it may be sold at distressed milk prices, and B, it's probably incurred pretty expensive transportation costs to move it that far. So it has been an issue, and one of the other discussions that I'm hearing a little bit more of is something that is similar to what's happened to California over the last several years. They've bumped up against their processing capacity a number of times, and the major cooperatives out there have an in-house quota in place for the amount of milk that a farm can sell and produce at a value. Now, if they need milk, then that quota doesn't really bind, but if they are surplus and don't really have a home for it, then the quota comes into place. And I've heard other co-ops in other parts of the country, because of this problem this year, finding homes where it's been in discussion.
Okay, that's good insight. Another question came in. regarding farm transfers. Someone asked a question about that they've taken over the family farm, had signed up previously, but the question is, will the production history follow, I think, given the new ownership situation?
The answer is currently yes. So if a farm has been transferred within the family, or even if it was sold outside of the family, that the production history is transferred with the farm if people want that to be the case. So that's usually what's been happening here. There has been some discussion with Farm Service Agency talking about the problem of bringing a new family member back into a farm. So rather than a complete transfer of the operation, expansion of the operation and not having the ability to cover a lot of new milk that may be brought on as a result of that. There's been just some discussion about relaxing those constraints, but it hasn't been done yet.
Okay, good to know. I have a question on the milk market outlook that you presented. Slide 12 on your presentation looks at the futures markets and basically how that's changing. And it was interesting to know, based on some of your other comments, what was driving the current uptick on Class 4, given, is that from the domestic demand for those products, just given the weakness in the export markets? What's driving that?
Two things that have happened there. One is that our butterfat prices and values have been really quite extraordinary and have been increasing since this time period where you saw that trough and then moving up. So part of that is the value of butter, but we've also had, since the Global Dairy Trade Index has had some recovery in their skim milk powder prices as well, actually been pretty big. And so I think that given the optimism about those prices recovering, the two things, butterfat and skim solids in that Class 4, have caused futures markets to rethink what the Class 4 value might be.
And if we played that out further, Mark, I don't know how far those go out. I mean, what are you seeing there? And obviously the market is what it is, but what do you think in terms of kind of what the market signals are telling us for those prices as we look into 2016?
Well, let's take a quick look. This is, see if I can blow that up a little bigger for you. This was yesterday's trading values for Class 4 futures in the green line, and the red line are our Class 3 futures. So you can see that there's been quite a bit of optimism showing those market values closing as we get into the early part of 2016 and increasing a little bit over that time period. It's still hovering around the $16 range, but that's a whole lot better than it has been.
Right. Good. And also good to show some of the information that's available there on dairymarkets.org. Question came in regarding what was the typical coverage level that was purchased last year, and also I guess would be I'd add on to that, in what were in general terms some of the participation levels?
Well, participation varied around the country. We had about 55% of dairy farms that signed up for MPP. But if you look at the potential historic milk production that could have signed up, it was actually more like 75% of milk production that actually enrolled. So that tells us that in general it was larger farms that signed up than smaller ones. And so that's one piece of evidence out there about what happened. When you look at what was purchased in the way of coverage levels, by far the largest level was at $4. And last year, remember that graphic that I showed you where it was indicating we thought that there would be $10.50 margins throughout 2015. that was probably a very sensible thing for people to do. You know, they wanted to kind of just dip their toe in, see how the whole program worked, willing to spend $100. So that was the biggest level. The other two areas that were not quite as big but almost collectively was the $6 and the $6.50 level of coverage. I indicated there's kind of a price break after that where it gets to be much more expensive, and we had quite a few people sign up at the $6 and $6.50 level though.
Okay. And that's interesting given that you said that on average the participation was higher among larger farms, given that, because you mentioned that there's also a price break in the premium, you know, above and below 4 million pounds. Any insight into as to why? And I'm assuming as you go through the tool online that also factors in that for, you know, relatively smaller farms that would actually be more advantageous. Is that a correct reading of that?
Correct reading. But you know, we have had some larger farms who have played around a little bit with that % of coverage that you can do. So as an example, let's just say you had a 10 million pound production history. That would mean that, you know, the first 4 million pounds that you covered would be at that lower tier cost, and milk production above that would have been at the higher tier and much more expensive. So some of our farms in that case may have decided that I want to cover 40% of my historic production. In other words, 4 million pounds of milk. And, you know, all of that would have been at the lower tier. And then they may have decided if they needed additional risk management coverage that, you know, they would have done that with a forward contract or with hedging or something else for the other 60% of their milk.
Okay. All right, Mark. Well, I think we've hit most of the questions that have come in. Any final comments or observations you want to offer?
Well, I'll make one or two. I've heard a lot of people talking this year about dissatisfaction with the program. And I think what I hear is that it didn't pay out. And, you know, in truth, if you look at this, we've had some payments at the $8 level, but nothing below that. We collected something like $60 million in premiums and fees across the country, and by my estimation, we're likely to have something like $800,000 paid out. Or in other words, for every dollar that dairy farmers invested in premiums, they got a 1.3 cents back, you know, in the payout. Now, that is using this kind of idea of I'm looking at this as an investment rather than risk management. And I don't think that's the right way to look at any insurance. I mean, how many of us stand here at the end of the year going, you know, doggone it, I paid my auto insurance premiums on time, paid everything up. I didn't get so much as a scratch, let alone a fender bender, you know, this whole last year. Well, none of us do that. So think about this as insurance product and risk management. Don't think about it necessarily as an investment.
Mark, you there?
Yes, can you hear me? Or did I cut out?
We lost it there for a second. Okay.
Oh, sorry.
We're good. Well, again, Mark, we really appreciate the presentation and all the information. As Christy noted earlier, the recording and the slides will be posted online. Christy, anything else? All right, with that, we're going to sign off, and we appreciate everyone's attendance and joining us today for the webinar.
Thanks for attending.